Scary horror campfire tales. I picked the woods because the guidebook called them quiet. Little traffic, little light, little noise, the entry promised, like a lullaby for the overworked. The map labeled the area simply as Hemlock Tract, but the ranger at the trailhead, thin, wind-chapped, a scar cutting a neat white line through his eyebrow, smirked when I asked for directions. Locals call it the Whispering Woods, he said, stamping the back of my parking pass with a wet thunk. Wind funnels through the hollows in the branches. Makes sounds. Don't let it spook you. I grew up next to a train yard, I told him, trying to sound unspookable. I'll be fine. He nodded like he didn't believe me and turned to the next hiker. I tucked the map into my jacket and headed up the trail, the world narrowing to the creak of my pack straps and the crunch of frost-stiff needles under my boots. October's sun filtered through hemlock crowns and thinning gold, and somewhere far off a stream muttered to itself. The deeper I went, the quieter it felt, not just in sound but in attention, as if each tree I passed angled its invisible face toward me, then forgot me the moment I moved on. It wasn't the feeling of being watched so much as being very carefully not watched, the way people stare past someone they recognize and don't want to acknowledge. By late afternoon, I found a mossy flat near the stream and set my tent beneath a hemlock with a trunk as thick as a stove. I stretched guy lines, drove stakes, shook the nylon until it hummed a little. My breath fogged and climbed through a spill of needles like stubborn smoke. The air smelled like damp iron and rot, the good, forest kind that promises everything is being broken down for spring. I boiled water on my little stove and dropped in a tea bag. The steam rose as a single pale rope and unraveled. Calm moved into me by degrees. For the first time in months, the inside of my head felt like a room with the windows open. When the wind started, it was a soft combing through the boughs, a hushing that grabbed the loose hairs at my temples. Then it threaded itself, honest to God, into syllables. Just shapes of sound, almost words, like a mouth practicing in a mirror. S'there. I smiled despite myself. Whispering Woods. Okay, cute. I raised my mug in a little salute to the trees. Clever, I said, loud enough to sound confident, louder than I needed to be alone. The wind swelled and the stream answered with a clatter of pebbles. I watched the surface of the water for a while. The flow seemed wrong, like the ripples moved upstream for a second, then corrected. My eyes watered in the cold. When I blinked, everything was normal again. Calm, sudden calm, like a heartbeat. The woods had rhythm. Night brought a toothy moon and a sky as black as a wetted stone. I zipped my tent, hung my food bag, and tucked myself into the chemically warm hug of my sleeping bag. Through nylon, I could hear the stream speak in that endless voice that only has 3 words, over and over, and the wind sifting the needles. The first odd thing was small, a tapping on the side of the tent that matched my breathing. In, tap, out, tap. It went on long enough for me to hold my breath and count. When I stopped breathing, it kept time with my racing heart instead. Breathe, I told myself. It's a branch snagged on your tent. It's physics. I unzipped and craned my head out. A low cold fell on my face like a shroud. My headlamp picked out branches in the pale arch of the stream. Nothing touched the tent wall. The tapping stopped anyway. Back inside, I set my watch alarm for 2 a.m. I'd promised myself a few long exposure shots of the constellations, and turned onto my side. Sleep came in stitched pieces, and between them, rustles like someone smoothing paper, the soft tick-tick of cones hitting needles. Once, a laugh out in the trees that turned into 2 deer coughing as soon as I sat up. When the alarm chimed, I crawled out like a larva and breath steamed around my mouth in shreds. I set up the tripod, aimed the camera, and let the shutter chew on the darkness for 30 seconds at a time, a minute, 2. In one long exposure, a pale thread crossed the frame. I told myself it was a plane, even though it moved too crookedly. When I checked the images later, that thread divided into short dash marks like a series of footsteps. I turned the lamp off and let my eyes adjust. That's when I saw someone standing on the far side of the stream, just a shape between 2 trunks, thin, tall, slightly bent, like a person who'd been hung up to dry and left too long. I froze and held very still because instinct tells you not to spook wild things, even when you are the wild thing, alone and soft and full of organs in the dark. The shape turned toward me. My name rose up out of the branches, whispered, yes, but not by the wind. It sounded like my mother saying it in the bathroom doorway when she thought I was asleep. It sounded like an old friend calling to me at a bar. I flicked my headlamp on. Nothing. The trunks were just trunks. The stream muttered on, the same 3 words, over and over. Okay, I said to the beam of light, to the tent, to the hollow air. Okay. I packed the camera and crawled back into the sleeping bag, the zipper teeth closing like a mouth. I lay awake until the sky went from pitch to gunmetal, counting my heartbeats in blocks of 10, and trying to remember all the rules about panic that I had read during a less dramatic time of my life. Count, breathe, label. I labeled sounds, needles, stream, owl, tent fabric, my own blood. Twice, the label was footsteps. I fell asleep at last in the bruised light of almost dawn. When I woke again, the woods were gold and ordinary. The oddness, as always, shrank in daylight until it could be tucked into a smile. I made oatmeal. I wrote in my notebook, wind whispers, saw someone, might be deer. I drew a tiny cartoon deer with a speech bubble that said my name. To prove I was fine, I took a day hike. The trail along the stream was a ribbon flung through boulders and roots. Mushrooms crowded the deadfall like cities. I turned over one damp log and found an ant colony, frantic, seething, glossy. When I straightened, the log wasn't where I thought I'd left it. It had rolled, or I had misremembered. My sense of north went slightly gummy. I took out the compass. The needle quivered as if anxious. I kept to the blazes, even when the trees seemed to hold them just out of reach. Once I saw a second set of blazes, a faint older blue that wandered off into the trees like an invitation. I stood there too long, breathing cold air that tasted like metal, and realizing I could hear someone down that unmaintained path. A voice, hushed and impatient, like someone trying not to be heard. Help, it said, except it was saying it wrong, syllables stretched and inverted. El pe, el pe. I turned back to the main trail and walked faster. When I reached camp again, the oatmeal pan was where I'd left it. The tent hummed the same note in the breeze, and 3 little cairns had appeared in a line just outside the zipper, each stacked precisely 3 stones high. I hadn't built them. I waited for a mouse to show itself, or a raccoon to amble out, or a YouTuber to jump from behind a tree and tell me I'd been pranked. I see you, I said, because the part of me that grew up in the folk song part of America believed that naming a thing made it less dangerous. The wind moved through the hemlocks like a long exhale. It must have been around mid-afternoon when the light began to get syrupy, that heavy last hour of sun feeling when shadows stretched like dog leashes. I made tea again. I stood at the stream. It slipped around stones like a quick animal. Then, without any fuss, a set of ripples pushed upstream, paused against an exposed root, and fanned out. A second later, the wind in the boughs assembled itself into a sentence shaped exactly like my mother's voice. Come inside. You're gonna get sick. I turned so fast I nearly fell. Nothing stood behind me. My tent was just nylon. The hemlock's bark was ridged and dull and damp. My tea tasted like ash. Not funny, I told the air, and my breath came out quick and bird-like because it had hit me. Of all the voices in the world, the woods had reached for the one that could yank me by the spine. I packed, not all at once. First the stove, then the food bag, then the roll of clothes. I left the tent up because packing it in the wind is like wrestling a giant, irritable moth. I told myself I was just being efficient, getting a jump on morning. The ranger's voice ticked in my head. Don't let it spook you. When dusk finally broke apart and fell piece by piece into the underbrush, the woods changed key. You don't know how tuned the day world is until it retunes itself around you, until the silences are full of other silences, and you can't find the original quiet anymore. The tapping returned. The first tap came from behind my head, the second from near my feet, the third from somewhere to the left, as if hands were testing the tent for thin spots. I clicked my headlamp on. The cone of light caught a half circle denting the fabric, like a finger drawn down it from the outside. I reached out and pressed back with one finger of my own, absurdly polite. The pressure on the other side increased, pressing my finger toward the bone. I yanked my hand away. The tent wall sprang flat. Then, so fast the breath didn't have time to leave me, something dragged its nail, or a thorn, or a twig, down the length of the tent with a squeal that snapped the quiet in half. The zipper danced. I scrambled for the hatchet I kept near the door, the handle slick with my sweat. A shadow went by outside, long and quick, too quick, as if a man were running on all fours and also not touching the ground at all. I counted. It sounds ridiculous, but it put numbers between me and the urge to sob. At 60, I realized the whispering had moved inside the tent. Not loud. A thready undervoice licking between the nylon fibers, syllables without breath behind them. The hatchet felt stupid. What do you hit when the thing is everywhere? I did the only thing that made sense. I unzipped the tent and stepped out. The night smelled like bruised needles and the metallic breath of the stream. My headlamp chopped through trunks, through pale rectangles onto bark. When I turned in a slow circle, the light caught faces. Not faces. Knots and burrowed wounds, where branches had died and been absorbed. But in the blown dust of my panic, they looked like faces. I picked one and walked toward it, hatchet up like a toy, because fear can make you brutal with the wrong things. Close up, the burl did look like a face after all, not shaped like one. No eyes, nose, mouth, but detailed like one. Texture suggesting lip and cheekbone and the stretched tautness of skin. The wind moved through the crown above, and the tree exhaled. The burl sang. Not a song exactly, a phrase, a scrap of spoken air blown through tiny holes in dead wood. Come inside. If I'd had less sleep or more courage, maybe I would have laughed. The woods were a pipe organ, and the wind was playing it, and the song it chose was every voice I cared about. But it wasn't just the wind. There was something wet behind the burl. Sap or resin, maybe, except it smelled like a place that had never seen sun. Without deciding to, I brought the hatchet down. The burl cracked. A darker wetness slipped out, tacky and cold as a tongue. Under it, not wood, not sapwood, not heartwood. Something white and laced and delicate as a spidered bone. It moved. I stumbled back, headlamp zigzagging madly. The other burls around me murmured like a stadium crowd at the instant before a goal. The whisper from the tent inside was not inviting me in. It was describing what had already happened to someone else. Come inside wasn't a call. It was a report. In the corner of my beam, something leaned from behind a trunk and looked at me. Not a person. Or a person too long inside a trunk, peeled forward like a page. Its skin, or bark, or the layer where skin had once been, was lined like wood grain. Its eyes were where knots had been. When it moved, the movement felt wrong, like sheets sliding off a bed by themselves. I have never had a weapon feel less like a solution than the moment I lifted the hatchet toward it. It did not charge. It did not howl. It breathed. The sound roped through branches and burls and hollows and came back translated into 50 worried voices. My mother, my first crush, a teacher who once told me my handwriting was careful. You're tired. Come inside. I threw the hatchet. It hit a trunk and bounced uselessly. I snatched the emergency kit from the tent, flare, whistle, a cheap Bic lighter, and yanked the cap off the flare with trembling teeth. The rasp failed the first time, then caught on the second, and the world went red. The thing recoiled, not from the light, but from something the flare did to the air. Resin bubbled from a trunk, and in it were tiny white threads like roots. They twisted. The whispering grew frantic and then broke apart into 1,000 papery beats. Dry moths? No. Leaves, last year's, freed from under needles, fanning the flare as if trying to blow it out. I held the light high and ran. The way back to the trailhead was a mess of wrong turns I didn't remember making in the first place. Red light stuttered on trunks and dying ferns. Whispering flanked me, the words losing shape as I outran whoever's mouth they had borrowed. Something thumped in the dark like a giant slow heartbeat. The flare burned down, an angrier red, spitting. I made the stream by luck or instinct and followed it down because water always leads somewhere people build things. The bank sucked at my boots. At one point I fell, and the flare hissed into wet pebbles and died with a small scream that sounded like the whine of my own name clipped short. Dark slammed down, absolute for a heartbeat, and then the moon filled in the blank. My lungs were razors. The whispering receded. I walked until the trees thinned and the path widened, and the parking lot rose out of the world like a fact I'd invented and forgotten. My car sat where I'd left it. Another car parked 2 spots away wore a glitter of frost. I slid into the driver's seat and shut the door. The instant the door sealed, the silence felt like a lid. I had to press my forehead to the wheel to remember how to breathe. I left the tent. I left the hatchet where it fell. I left 3 little cairns and a pan crusted with sugared oatmeal. I left something else too, I think, even if I can't say what. The ranger's booth was empty, closing time long gone, and the road out was a black ribbon sagging between fields of dead goldenrod. Half an hour down the highway, with the radio off and the vents blowing heat that smelled faintly of dust and mouse, I heard it again. A whisper inside the ducting, a breath through some tiny plastic hollow, shaped by heat exchanger fins and lint into not quite words. Elpe. I turned the fan off. I cracked the window and let cold rake my face. The whisper moved with the air. When I shut everything, it quieted, the way a trapped thing grows still when there's nowhere to run. Home was 3 hours away. By then, the whisper had settled into the joints of the car, into the small hollows where fabric met door, where the dashboard met glass. At one gas station, I stood inside the bright fluorescence for a full 10 minutes, pretending to read labels on beef jerky, so that all the vents in the world were whispering at other people and not me. I got home, checked the locks twice, and drew the curtains tight. The radiator clanked on like an old friend. My apartment smelled like laundry soap and curry, the latter permanently lodged in the air from neighbors down the hall. I took a shower that went from too hot to too cold unexpectedly, hung a towel, and crawled into a bed that had never looked so civilized. Sleep came poorly. At 3:22 a.m., a whisper woke me, not in the room. Inside the pillow, in the down, in the baffles, a complicated set of chambers designed to shape air. I sat up slowly, very carefully, as if hurt sudden movements might make. The whisper followed the motion of my breath, because that's what it had learned. I got up and moved through the apartment, touching things. The neck of a bottle, the mouth of a vase, the little flute of the bathroom sink drain. When I leaned close enough, each one exhaled a different version of my name back at me. Not loud, not threatening, just aware. I pulled the plug on the bathroom sink and poured in bleach. I taped over the air vents with duct tape. By dawn, the apartment looked like the lair of someone who'd lost a long, complicated argument with the ghost of a hardware store. At 9, I called the park office to report abandoned gear, and because it felt like the responsible thing, to say that someone might be lost out there mimicking distress calls. The ranger with the scarred eyebrow answered. When I tried to explain, my mouth felt full of bark. "Wind'll do that to you," he said when I finished. His voice was professional, cautious. "Good you got out. Hemlock Tract has pockets, bad air in pits, weird acoustics, makes you think you're hearing things." He paused. Paper sounded in the background. "If you want your gear, we can send someone to collect it." "Not me. I'm off today." I swallowed. "That's okay. Let the woods have it." He made a note. We said goodbye. The line clicked dead. I held the phone to my ear until it cooled. When I set it down, I heard the whisper again, coming from the narrow slot where the case met the screen. I took the phone apart with a butter knife and put it in a drawer. It has been 3 nights. The whisper has not stopped. It is not always words. Sometimes it's breaths or sibilants, the pieces of speech without vowels, as if consonants are spores that can drift and cling. When buses sigh to a stop outside, when the radiator exhales, when I drink from a glass and set it down, I hear the woods. If I hold my breath long enough, the sounds sync up with my heart, then with the pipes, then with the window seals, then spread thin over everything until nothing is silent and nothing is loud. I sit in the middle of my apartment and think about the stream running backward for a moment, like a trickster letting a mask slip. Last night, I dreamed of hemlocks arranged in a circle, and in the paint-smooth center of each burl there was my face, and in the center of my face there was a hole, and from that hole the wind sang sentences of me to the other trees. "Come inside, come inside, come inside." I woke to the taste of sap in my mouth. I keep telling myself this is an ending, resolved if ragged. I got out. I am home. That's how these stories finish. But sometimes, just before I fall asleep, I think about the flare and the way the roots reared back like cut nerves. I think about the thing that leaned out of the tree with eyes where knots had been. It didn't chase me. It only breathed. As if what it wanted wasn't to bring me back, but to send something of itself along with me. This morning, I stepped out to get the mail. On the stairwell landing, someone had arranged 3 small cairns of gray pebbles, precisely 3 stones high, in a neat little line. Just a prank, I told myself. Just kids. When I shut the door, the apartment exhaled through 100 tiny hollows. The whisper shaped itself to fit my name perfectly, and this time, for a heartbeat, it sounded like my own voice answering back. They call them the Forbidden Woods, but the map I bought at the petrol station called them Parcel 17B. It was the mismatch that bothered me. Names worn down to numbers, warnings smoothed into bureaucratic euphemism. The wooden post at the verge still held the ghost of a sign. 4 screws in a rectangle, the wood paler where a plaque had once been. Someone had dragged a black marker across the post, wrote, "Don't." I stepped over the ditch. The first thing I noticed was the smell. I grew up near pines, and these trees were cousins of scent I knew. Resin and sun, warm bark and gingerbread dust. But everything here was rawer, greener. The understory was a tangle of hazel and bramble. The ground sighed under each footfall, as if the whole forest were breathing through the peat. A long abandoned track tunneled into the dark, the canopy knitted so tight it turned afternoon to evening in a dozen steps. I had come alone. Of course, there's nobody to argue with when you say the word forbidden, but only mean interesting. My pack groaned when I shrugged it off in a patch of heather. I told myself I'd be careful. I told myself I'd be quick. I told myself I'd test out the new stove and be back on the road before dusk. The stove hissed like a tame snake. I boiled water and watched steam try to rise in the closed, damp air. I recorded a voice memo, because that's what I do when I mean to keep the day from dissolving into blur. "North edge of Parcel 17B, I said. "Lat long approximately." I rattled off numbers, panned my phone in a slow circle, caught trunks marching like soldiers, lichens like frayed lace. "No bird song," I added. "Odd, otherwise beautiful." When I turned, there was a small pile of stones stacked beside my boot that hadn't been there before. 3 pebbles, anthracite dark, balanced in a neat little cairn. I wasn't startled. Forests make things out of you, if you let them. If it wasn't there, I wasn't looking. Still, I nudged the cairn over with my toe, making a polite slide of them, and told myself I'd imagined it. The tea tasted of tin and moss. The air held still as a held breath. Farther in, the track broke into deer trails, the kind that look like footpaths until you commit and discover they were made by something half your height. I tied orange tape around a branch. I'm not proud. I'm new here. Bright color means breadcrumb in my head. I walked 10 minutes, stopped, turned, made sure the tape burned neon behind me through the dim. I walked another stretch and tied another strip. When I looked back again, there were 2 tapes. One fluttered where I'd left it. The other, my second, was gone. Not gone, moved. It hung ahead of me, 2 trees deeper into the wood, the knot the same clumsy figure 8 I always make, my torn edge identical. As though I had, in a lapse I couldn't remember, walked further and tied it there. As though the forest had reached forward with a branch and pinched it into place. "Wind," I said out loud and laughed. Nothing in there laughed with me. The silence had texture. It felt like cord wrapped tight around a wrist. Time drifted. The light never changed. My compass needle took up a subtle tremor and began to argue with itself. The map swept to gradient lines and then to white space, where it said there should be a farm track and a property boundary, but the black rectangle of the fence never appeared. I found prints, my boots, my tread pattern, the narrow scuff of a stone that had lodged in the left heel, only pointing ahead. I stopped walking and stood still in them. They didn't become mine. They continued forward into the brush, an invitation penned in mud. I spoke another memo, forced lightness into my voice. "Okay," I said. "Odd. The map's wrong, or I am. There's probably a local loop. If you find this, I owe you beer." I meant the joke for some future self who would listen back and roll their eyes fondly. That's when the whispering began. I call it whispering because it was the closest word my head had ready, but it wasn't human. It was a sound like fabric rubbing, breath through reeds, needles sliding over one another. It had direction without source. It gathered behind me and then melted away when I turned. When I paused, it grew curious. When I moved, it pretended it had been somewhere else all along. Every time I tried to pin it to a trunk, the trunk turned out to be unpinnable. I set up the tarp as the first sensible thing I could think of. a rectangle of olive nylon slung between two straight-limbed pines, a habit that brings false order to wild places. I made a small meal and left the pot to soak. A breeze arrived, or something that wore the breeze like a mask. It threaded my tarp and plucked the guy line, guitar string taut. Plink. The sound rang and died. Plink. I tightened the line. Plink. There were 3 pebbles sitting on the corner of my ground sheet when I looked down, stacked in a neat little tower. Cute, I said. And then, because something in me didn't want to be rude to whatever had a sense of humor, I stacked my own 3 pebbles a foot to the left. Mine were messier. They wanted to be stones again and not a joke. There in that dim, colorless world, I decided I would sleep. You can laugh at me. You can say you would have left. But the path back had been overwritten by too many copies of itself. The map was a story, and my story had wrong pages glued in. Night would come either way, if there even was a night underneath that ceiling. Better to face it with food and shelter. I lay in my bag and listened to the whispers gather. They found their rhythm around me, a slow stirring. The tarp creaked. The stove, cold and empty, pinged as it lost the last of its heat. Something patted just beyond my shoes. Twice I caught the impression of a shape at the edge of vision. Tall, thin, its vertical weight wrong for a tree. But each time I blinked, it became a trunk, confidently itself. Sleep came differently there. I fell into it like stepping off a curb I'd forgotten was there. I dreamed I was making tea, and my own face rose in the water, a reflection before I poured, and I saw not eyes but 2 polished knots where knots should not be. And then I tasted bark on my tongue, and woke lengthwise to a noise like words trying not to be words. I had left my phone on. It lay screened down on my jacket. The memo app had recorded an hour and 40 minutes of perfumed silence and low traveling sound. At 1 hour and 39, the forest taught itself to pronounce my name. It said it the way a child said a word they'd only ever seen written. It broke me into syllables, carefully, tenderly, as if the mouth that wasn't a mouth wanted it to be right. The voice was mine, of course. It had been practicing with what I gave it. I sat up so fast the tarp chimed again. Breath fogged the air. The fog hung too long. My exhale smeared the night and stayed like a bruise in the air. When I swept my hand through it, eddies turned into fingerprints that weren't mine. That's when I saw the hair tied to the branch. A bit of brown, caught where I'd knotted my orange tape. A hair of length and color not a deer's, not a fox's. Mine, then. The branch wound it once, twice, as deliberate as thread. It didn't seem sinister until I understood the economy of it. The woods had collected my scent, my dead cells, whatever was willing to fall. It had gathered me. Enough, I said, though to whom I couldn't say. I yanked the tarp down, shoved the stove into my pack, cinched straps with hands that didn't want to obey. I left the ground sheet where it was, the 3 pebbles politely balanced on the corner. I left, foolish as any fairy tale boy, with the feeling that leaving would be seen as a breach of etiquette, punished more harshly than theft. I followed my prints, not the neat, ahead-of-me ones that had invited me forward, but a set I trusted that curved back the way I remembered. The whispering ceded to me as I passed, then resumed at my back, like a crowd that didn't want trouble for itself, but liked the weather of it. The first sign of the clearing was the sound changing. Whisper became something that wanted to be a word again. Then the air lost its resin and traded it for iron. Through the last rank of trunks, I found a space like a shallow bowl, centered by a dead tree so black it drank light. Around it stood more of those neat little stacks of pebbles, taller here, 5 or 7 stones apiece. Dozens of stacks like a ritual no one had taught me, but everyone expected me to know. My ground sheet lay at the base of the black tree. I had left it behind, and here it was. My 3 stones still perched on the corner. I would have told you I was sure, the fold in the nylon, the smear of stove black. It was the same sheet. It had got here by the same roots that had moved the tape and duplicated my steps. The figure stood behind the tree. I saw it in pieces first, the gray of my jacket, the slope of my shoulders, before my brain finished the arithmetic and put me together. I picked up my sheet like it was a shield and said nonsensically, "That's mine." Because what else do you say to yourself when you're not expecting to meet you here of all places? My voice came from the figure with a half-beat delay, like a phone call bouncing off a satellite. "That's mine," it said, obediently, and I heard my own inflection, my breath, the little irony I put on mine because I never quite believe anything I own stays mine for long. It stepped into the open. It wore my jacket and my shoes and the face I shave in the mirror. It had got the eyes wrong. They were polished wood, yes, but deeper, knots filled with resin that caught light and drowned it. It smiled, and the smile stayed on too long. There are ways you are supposed to behave, faced with your double. I did none of them. I reached for my pack and found the flare I carry because of a story I told once about being prepared. I gripped it until the knurl bit palm and skin. "Say my name," I said, because I wanted the lie to split somewhere, wanted a seam to open. The thing obliged. It shaped my name perfectly now, every vowel rounded like a bead. It took a step closer. The pebbles shivered on their pedestals. "Why?" I said. "Why me?" "Why me?" it sang back, pleased. "Why me?" The whispering gusted, and out of it rose other voices, some with edges, some features smoothed away by weather. A woman with a rasp, a man with a lisp, a child who giggled at what laughing sounded like. "Don't," one said, so faint I couldn't place the age. "Don't trade." I struck the flare. It spat white like a dropped star. Light climbed the black tree and hung there. The figure flinched, not like a vampire in a cartoon, not a hiss and a leap, but the flinch of anything that had never had to blink. Its hands came up too slowly. It reached for me like I was a tool to be used, and in that reaching I understood the twist of it. The forbidden woods weren't guarded by a beast that hunted outsiders. The woods bought themselves a human. They took what you left in them, your breath, your hair, your voice, and built a version. Not to kill you, but to trade for you. Who would stop a thing that wore your face from walking out? Who would believe you when you were left behind the line of trees, whispering through a throat you no longer owned? The other stacks of stones trembled. One toppled. Pebbles skittered. Somewhere the whispers said stay and take and mine and go all together. I held the flare like a priest might hold a relic. I moved sideways, and the figure moved to keep me centered. The dead black tree had grown a ring of nails hammered into it, all the way around, each bent and rusted, each holding a loop of something thin and pale. Hair, yes. Threads. Straps. I thought of all the knots in my life and saw them here, physical, cataloged. "Step back," I said. "Step back," it said, and shifted a half step in a way that meant I am learning what orders are. I tossed the flare. I meant to throw it at the thing's feet or the base of the tree, but light has a way of choosing its home. It fell against the black bark and slid into a cleft, and for a second the tree looked like a throat swallowing fire. A line of sap hissed and ran. The smell of iron turned to something like sugar burning on the bottom of a pan. The figure's eyes glassed over, then bubbled at the edges like sap, perfect amber leaking. It screamed with my scream. It made every primitive thing in me want to answer. I used the flare's afterimage to blind me to my own face and ran. The trail was not a trail anymore. It was a series of permissions the forest revoked as I tried to use them. Green threw its shoulder into me. Branches plucked at my hood. The whispering tried to shape my name into a plea. Come back, and then into a command. "Come back," the woods insisted in my mother's low voice, and my knees buckled out of reflex before I swore and forced them straight. I dropped the map on purpose and felt a ridiculous triumph at the waste of it. Somewhere behind me, the flare died with a last pop. Night rushed in. That's when the bells began. They were small bells, many of them, hung high, hung low, hung somewhere in between, their tones silver and cracked and bronze dull. They chimed on a wind I did not feel anywhere else, and the notes made a fence. I stumbled toward the sound and found the ditch where I had crossed, stagnant water shivering with reflected bells, and I recognized the 4 screws on my side of the post. The sign still gone. The marker ink sweating in the damp. Don't. I fell over the ditch like a swimmer who has forgotten how to walk. Cars existed again. Birds existed again, though they flinched like I had at every cherry-red taillight. I walked the verge until gravel turned to tarmac, until tarmac turned to shop lights, until the petrol station where I had bought my deeply unhelpful map opened its door and released the smell of fried sugar and newsprint. The clerk looked at me like I'd brought the forest in with my shoes, and perhaps I had, a little peat on the mat, a thread of damp on the sleeve. He asked if I was all right. I made a sound I wanted to be a laugh. He sold me coffee. I sat on the curb and played my voice memo and heard the woods say my name again in a voice that was not hungry. At least not the way I understand hunger. It said my name like a key it had almost got to fit. At home, the smell of smoke followed me through hot showers and drafty windows. I listened to the memo at my desk, over good speakers, and discovered the part I had not noticed in the field. Under the practice of my name, under the reeds and the needles, was another voice speaking just once. It was thin with distance, but it was human, and it said, "Don't trade places. Don't answer yourself." I didn't sleep that night. Sleep was a clearing with a black tree in it, and I had learned what trees can do with light. In the morning I packed to go back. Don't think I'm an idiot for that. There are wrong reasons to return, and there are right ones. You can decide which mine are. I had left my ground sheet before the woods had given it back to me. It felt like a debt. I had a strand of long hair knotted around a nail in my pocket, brown and a little elastic, and I don't know if it was mine, but the skin of my neck ached as if something had been plucked there. As I dressed, I found a half moon of dark resin on my throat, crescent-shaped and sticky despite hot water. I peeled it away and set it in a saucer like a tooth. At the door, I hesitated over my phone. I erased the memo and then stopped with my finger hovering over the trash. The forest had learned my voice because I had given it my voice. This was true. But the forest had also tried to warn me through someone else who had given theirs. I left the file alone. I told myself I was collecting evidence. I told myself every lie I needed. On my way out, I stopped at the petrol station and asked the clerk if he had ever heard of Parcel 17B. He said there was a story about a boy who'd gone missing in the woods once, long time ago, before the sign fell off the post. He told it like it was a weather pattern that no longer applied. Before I left, he added, almost as an afterthought, "My mum said she used to hear bells on the wind when she was little. Said you followed them, and you found your way out." I haven't gone back yet. When I fold laundry, I catch my reflection in the dark TV, and sometimes my smile stays on too long. When I boil water, the kettle breathes the name the woods made out of me, and I don't answer, because I learned not to. When I walk past a stack of books, with 3 on one side and 3 on the other and 1 on top, I knock the top one over on purpose, and I feel good about that. Sometimes at the very edge of sleep, I hear the forest practicing someone else's name, learning them syllable by syllable the way it learned me. I don't know if it's mercy or cruelty that I recognize the voice beneath the practice now, the thin human voice that says, "Don't trade, don't answer." Sometimes I say, "I won't," into the pillow, not because I think it can hear me through pain and brick and distance, but because I want the promise written somewhere outside my skull. And last night, when I let myself look in the mirror too long, there it was, the smallest crescent reflection where none should be, the barest glint of amber caught deep in the black of my eye. I blinked, and it was gone. Of course it was gone. You wouldn't believe me if I said otherwise. I won't ask you to believe any of it. Only this: if the path narrows so perfectly it feels made for you, if your name comes to you from a place without a mouth, if you find what you left behind thoughtfully returned, don't call it hospitality. The forbidden woods are polite. Polite is not the same as safe. The bells still ring sometimes, even here. When they do, I stand very still, and I don't turn toward the sound, and I count to 3, and I wait to see which of us, me or the echo that learned me, will answer first. I didn't mean to make a record of what happened. The voice memo started by accident when my phone slid out of my jacket and clocked itself against the edge of the kitchen table. I didn't notice its red dot blinking until much later, and by then the idea that someone might one day listen felt like holding a flare in a cave. Maybe a stranger would find these words and follow them like breadcrumbs out of the trees. If that stranger is you, listen closely. The worst thing the woods can do is make you feel alone. The second worst is make you feel accompanied. I took the dirt road to the cabin at the tail end of a washed-out afternoon, one of those days where the sky is a damp woolen thing, all color wrung out of it. The road corkscrewed through black spruce and fir so dense you could lose a hand between them and not get it back until spring. Needles littered the mud like matted hair. My wipers ticked, once, twice, fighting a mist that wasn't rain so much as breath. By the time I found the turnoff, the sun had already started crawling down the far ridge. There was no cell service. The map app had given up 3 kilometers back, replaced by a square of digital shrug. The cabin itself looked like a punctuation mark at the end of the road, a squat, slanted roof thing with a porch just wide enough to put your boots side by side without touching. Somebody had nailed a set of elk antlers over the door long ago. Green lichen fuzzed the tines. The key, as the email promised, was under a flat rock by the step. I had booked it as a cheap retreat, 3 nights to untangle my head, finish a draft, hear my own thoughts without the cities. Rustic, the listing said. No Wi-Fi, no neighbors, plenty of quiet. There was a picture of a wood stove with a cheerful window of fire and a braided rug like a donut, a chipped blue kettle, and a guest log that looked like something to sign on your wedding day. Inside, the air was colder than out. Cold in that way that feels organized, intentional. Cold that forms a plan and carries it out. I set down my pack, flicked the switch by the door, and a single bulb over the kitchen sink crawled to life and immediately began to hum. It pulsed in a rhythm that made me think of breathing. Glow, pause, glow. The window above the sink showed me trees layered in gray. My reflection hovered pale in the glass and then vanished as the bulb took a rest. I did what you do when you want to feel at home quickly. I made small noises. I set the stove to tick with heat. I ran the tap to fill the kettle and listened to the pipes knock like a shy neighbor. The cabin accepted each sound and then filed it away, leaving the quiet exactly as I found it. A fly dozed on the inside of the window frame, its body a comma. I found the guest log on the mantel. The cover was soft as a palm. The first entry, in a round hand, September 12th, latched the door before dark. The date had no year. The next entry was a week later. The same round hand, the same looping R. September 19, latched the door before dark. Don't trust the knock. Someone else wrote a month's worth of tidy, careful script. Different ink, same words, always on different days, always the same warning. Then later pages shifted into block letters, as if a different mouth spoke through the same pen. Latch the door before dark. Don't trust the knock. You know the way an old place settles and pops like a sail? The cabin did that, an old boat shifting on a quiet water. Somewhere behind the wall, a mouse choreographed its evening. The kettle spoke a thin note as the first thread of steam curled out its spout. And then I saw it, a single dark footprint on the kitchen floorboards, wet, lifting toward the sink. Just one, right foot, heel, arch, toes clearly defined, and nothing left or right of it. No second print, no drip on the mat. The door was closed behind me and my boots were still on my feet. I stood looking at that print the way people stare at an equation they know they should be able to solve. The boards around it were dry. I half laughed at myself, squatted, pressed a finger into dampness that smelled faintly of iron, like coins rubbed between fingers. As I watched, the outline paled. The kitchen bulb flared hard, then dimmed like it had blinked. This place had character, I said aloud, just to get the words into the air. The sound of my voice settled on the table and didn't bounce. The wood stove took fire like it had missed it, and the cabin collected warmth around the metal. I made tea. I put my bag in the bedroom, a closet with a bed in it, more or less. The sheets were clean, folded sharp. A sliding bolt like a barn latch secured the front door. Next to it, a little hook and eye held a screen door so rusted the wire looked like it had been dipped in tea for a decade. On a whim, I tried the battery-powered radio on the bookshelf. Static. I spun the dial until my finger cramped. Occasionally it caught a voice and lost it again, a cough of weather or a fragment of country western, then a clean, empty hiss that wasn't silence so much as something waiting. There was a tin of dry soup packets in the cupboard and a jar of honey crystallized like amber. There were 4 forks, 3 spoons, 2 knives. There was a cassette player, honest to God, a cassette player, with a stack of tapes rubber banded together. They had titles written on masking tape spines. Wind 1, Wind 2, Knox, and on the bottom, if you hear this. I set Wind 1 in the player and pressed play, expecting a whooshing field recording. The tape clicked, spun, and a voice, not wind, came out. Male, maybe. Hard to tell. The sibilants had a burr like someone speaking with a strip of cloth in their mouth. When the path disappears, you're still on it. That's the trick. Trees like to watch you turn around. He laughed once dry, a shuffle of movement, then nothing but a thin hiss, and in it a noise that could have been wind or a breath near the microphone. I don't know why I didn't stop the tape. Because I was alone and wanted a voice in the room that wasn't mine. Because I've always been the kind of person who pries at scabs just to see if they still hurt. The kettle screamed. I made more small noises to keep the big ones away. Dusk came and slipped past without ceremony. The cabin got that reflecting quality. Windows become flat black pockets, and you are in a lit aquarium in the middle of a dark field. I latched the door before dark because everyone had written it. The bolt slid with a noise like a throat clearing. That's when the first tapping started. Just one gentle pressure on the screen door, the kind of knock you'd use on a sleeping baby's door. Then again, a fraction of a second sooner than it should have been. Tap, 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 tap. Branch, I said to the room. Loose twig. No wind. The trees out the window didn't move. The tapping resumed, quicker, less polite, as if whoever was doing it knew me better than to be deferential. I picked up knocks and slotted it in, like an idiot standing at the lip of a well throwing in coins just to hear the splash. At first, all I heard was silence amplified, the faint churn of the machine itself. Then, 3 heavy blows, close enough to the microphone to fuzz the recording. The sound made the hair across my arms stand up as if to listen. A man's breath afterward, ragged, same voice as before, but now closer to panic. You will want to answer it because she sounds like whoever you love most. Don't. That's not a she. It's not anybody. Another knock on the tape, softer now, conversational. On cue, the real world obliged with a mirror sound at my door. The latch ticked just a millimeter, as if settling under its own weight. In the radio hiss I heard, I swear to you I heard, a mouth wetness before words. Hey, came a voice from the other side of the screen, the exact pitch and cadence of my own when I'm trying to sound harmless. A voice you'd lend a phone to. Hey, it's me. I forgot the key. The cabin fell away from me, as if I'd taken a step backward on a staircase that wasn't there. In the tape hiss, the man's voice swallowed and spoke quick. It learns faster than you. It keeps what the cabin keeps. If you're hearing me. The cassette clicked to a stop with a neat end-of-sentence finality. The kitchen bulb flared, making a white stare on the window, and popped into darkness. The wood stove light threw wild shadows across the ceiling, antlers crawling like pale fingers. Hey, my voice said on the other side of the door, slightly discouraged now. Come on, it's cold. I got up like a puppet pulled by a string. A stupid part of me had the thought that I must have left something outside, my pack, a jacket, a part of myself. I put my hand on the bolt and felt the wood around it vibrating, not shaking, thrumming, as if a big instrument had been plucked and I was touching the body of it. In the black window over the sink, something moved. At first I thought it was my reflection catching up to me, just the delayed echo that happens when you move quickly in dim rooms. Then it slid along the glass in a way my reflection couldn't. It didn't face me. It didn't have a face, exactly. It had my height. It had the slouch I hate to see in photographs of myself. It stopped where the path from the road disappeared into spruce and stood there so still a layer of night settled over it like ash. On the door, my voice tried again. I left the thing in the car. You know the thing. Just open up. I did something very small, very deliberate. I lifted the bottom corner of the curtain with 2 fingers and set it back on the sill. The room felt like a lung that had waited too long between breaths. The latch made a sound like parentheses closing. And then, very carefully, not my hand pushed the bolt from the other side. It moved between my fingers, forcing its way, a patient, steady pressure like the tongue of a draft. The chair under the knob creaked as its legs skated a millimeter across the braided rug. The cabin was helping. No, the cabin was a doorman eager to oblige. I threw my weight against it. The bolt froze, halfway open. The wood hummed harder, a big note I could feel in my teeth. In that vibration I heard, this is going to sound insane, I heard the word welcome, phrased not as kindness but as function. A door opens, a mouth says hello. I dragged the heavy table across the floor with my hip and wedged it against the door. The teacup on it slid and fell and shattered, a bright white burst in the dark. I pulled the cassette, labeled, "If you hear this from the stack," with hands that didn't feel attached. The rubber band snapped my knuckles. I shoved the tape into the player and hit play with the heel of my hand. Silence. Then the voice, slower, tired. "If you're hearing this, you did the obvious thing. You came for the quiet. Listen, this place records you. That bulb, that radio, that window, they're not for you, they're for it. It doesn't need a face, it needs your pattern. It's patient. It will take your steps, your knock, your breath, and wear them like a jacket." A shuffle, a scrape, the sound of a pencil on paper. It can't cross without invitation. It can learn the sound of your consent and make you think you said it. So you have to trap your consent somewhere you can see it. He exhaled, a long, rough sound. Guest log, paper beats echo. There was a rapid knock then, close enough to the recorder to bump it. I heard the rattle of the cassette's case. The voice, calmer now. "Make your rule. Sign your name to it. Keep the book in your hand. When it asks, show it where your consent isn't. It hates the book. It hates anything heavy it can't wear." I tore the guest log from the mantel with such force the leather split. The taped binding of names yawed open in my hands like a jaw. I grabbed the pen stuck in its spine and wrote on the next clean page in letters as big as I could make them. "I do not invite you. I do not open to any voice that is mine, but not in this room. I do not open to any knock that isn't felt in my hand." I signed and dated it. The date looked wrong, so I wrote it again, bigger. I underlined "in this room." The cabin exhaled, a baffled little sigh through the chinks. The knock on the other side of the door changed. It became impatient, then mocking. It thudded in a stuttering rhythm that after a second I realized was my heartbeat, or rather, how my heartbeat sounded when I was trying not to be heard. "I can see you," my voice said, playful, right up against the split in the door with an intimacy that made something behind my jaw go numb. "You look scared." I held up the log like a priest holds up a book he believes will do something. "Then you can read," I said, and the words came out low and steady from somewhere I had not used in years. "Read this." Silence, then a scrape as if the screen door were being teased with a fingernail. The radio across the room stuttered into life unbidden and found a station for a single second. A woman singing a line about coming home, then static. The bulbs along the ceiling did a pathetic little knockoff of lightning and died for good. The thing at the window, my height, my slouch, stepped closer to the glass. The reflection made its edges slippery, but I could see the outline of ash where the wind had powdered the sill cling to something not quite touching it. The longer I looked, the less I saw a shape, and the more I saw the absence of one, like the image left on your eyelids after a flash. My own face superimposed itself as if the glass thought it would be a kindness. I did something else small. I poured a fistful of wood ash from the stove into my hand and blew it lightly across the window. The gray dust drifted like breath. Some of it touched the pane and stuck in an outline no human body could make. The place where its shoulder should have been bowed inward like a scythe. The head was too close to the frame, almost pressed against it, trying to be in the room without the process of entering. The dust slid, then fell, and the shape leaned back, resisting. "It learned that from someone," I said to the empty room, because my mouth had to move or I was going to scream. "It learned that trick from someone explaining ash once." I don't know how long I stood clutching the book like it could bite. The stove settled. The night put its hands against the glass. The knocks came less often, and like a child bored of a game, with less commitment. Then, sometime after a strike of wind dragged along the roof like a wet coat, there came a sound from the other side of the door that was so wrong, I'm not sure how to write it. Imagine the sound of someone smiling, made audible. Imagine a bend in a note where no bend belongs. Imagine hearing your own breath skip and realizing it is not a flaw in your lungs but a decision. "I'll wait," my voice said, suddenly mild. "You'll get sleepy." And that was the worst part. Because of course I would. Humans cannot be statues. The cabin knew that. It was built for that. Beds exist for a reason. I backed into the bedroom with the guest book under my arm and shut the door. There was no lock on it. I propped a chair under the knob like in movies, fully aware that doors like this are suggestions at best. I lay on the bed fully dressed, the pen tucked into the spine of the book, and listened to every noise that house had to offer. The pipes coughed. A knot in a floorboard cried out like a small animal. Outside, something big placed its feet very carefully. Somewhere near dawn, I slept the kind of sleep that is really several untrustworthy naps stacked end to end. When I sat up, the light through the curtain was thin and colorless, but it was light. I waited for the knock, and there was none. I waited for my voice and heard only mine. When I opened the bedroom door, the kitchen was exactly as I had left it, except that the broken cup had been swept into a tidy pile, and the broom leaned against the wall as if embarrassed to be caught out. The chair at the door had inched a hair away from the knob, as if someone with more patience than me had moved it, atom by atom, just to prove they could. I took the guest log with me. I didn't put it back on the mantel. I tucked it under my jacket, against my heart, because I had the childish thought that paper wants to be near heat. I unlatched the door. I slid the bolt. I opened to nothing, to trees wet close as a whisper, no tracks on the porch. The ash I'd blown against the window had turned to a wet smear that the first touch of dew erased. The path out should have been easy. It wasn't. The dirt road did a little trick of geometry on me where it seemed to take me forward, and then, with a soft turn, put me back where I'd been without the usual signage of that return. I recognized a knot in a birch like a closed eye and thought, "You again." The third time I saw it, I stopped, pointed at nothing, and said, "No." The fourth time, the road behaved and sloped downward toward my car as if it had been doing that all along. The hood was furred with needles. Inside, my phone had found a bar of service and was blinking like a bird that just discovered a window is not sky. I drove out. I didn't look in the rear view after the first bend because I didn't trust that I'd see the right thing in it. At the highway, I pulled over and breathed the chemically forgiving smell of gasoline and someone else's cigarettes, like a person trying new air after a long illness. The guest book rode shotgun. The cassette player sat in my lap, as if we had been old enemies and were now obliged to travel together. When I got home, the voice memo on my phone had done me the favor of catching everything from a certain point on. My tea, my stupidity with the tapes, the knock, the words, my breathing acting like a machine under stress. I've listened to it more times than I should, trying to catch the moment when I became a person this could happen to. On good days, I think that moment doesn't exist. Anyone at the right address at the wrong hour will do. On bad days, I think the cabin picks, and it picked me because I carry quiet around like a rind. There is a final twist, the one that keeps me awake even when the lack of sleep starts to feel like someone else's problem. On the recording, right after my voice says, "Read this," and the silence comes down like a lid, another voice speaks. It's less a voice than a grafting of one, stitched out of mine. Not the thing at the door. The me in the room. The me who wrote in the book. It's so faint I missed it the first dozen listens, but it's there, and once you hear it, you can't make it unhappen. "I'll wait," it says, warm with patience. "You'll get sleepy." The phone caught me answering back to myself without realizing I had done it. That's not how suggestion works. That's how infection does. That cabin keeps more than patterns. It keeps echoes warm like bread in a drawer. If you come for quiet, it gives you your quiet back, wearing another face. I thought the guest log in my house would be ballast enough. It sits on my desk, open to my refusal. I touch it like a stupid talisman. As I write this, the window across the room throws my reflection back at me, faithful and uninteresting. The radiator ticks. City noise combs its fingers through the street. But some nights, when the lights glitch, even for a blink, I hear a knock that doesn't belong to this building. Not loud, not threatening, just an interest. And once, a week ago, just after 3 in the morning, my phone vibrated with a voicemail from an unknown number. No words, just a breath that could have been wind, and then the faintest old-school click of tape spooling up. I'm leaving this here because the woods are older than the maps that lead into them, and older than the maps that lead out. Because we like to think doors are simple questions and even simpler answers. Because you can tell yourself you wouldn't open, that you are not that kind of fool, that your hand is your own. Maybe it is. I hope it is. But if you find yourself in a cabin at the end of a road, and the room learns your breath, and something outside desire lines your voice out of the air and hands it back to you, do me this favor. Write your rule in the book. keep it in your hand. And if you hear someone tonight saying these words outside your door, sounding so much like me, you can picture the way my mouth makes them. Please, please, do not let me in.